Good morning. I think the cicadas are quiet enough today that I could come back out to the porch and share with you. We are continuing our series on Apocalypse Now, wondering about what does COVID-19 and all the other things that are going on in the world today tell us perhaps about the end times. What does the Bible tell us about the end times? Yesterday we learned about Daniel and how the story in Daniel 6 of Daniel in the lion's den kind of parallels the vision in Daniel 7, where a faithful person in Daniel 6, it is Daniel, and Daniel 7, it is obviously prefiguring Christ. A faithful person, a single person who seems to be so weak and unable to counter great and terrifying beasts actually is the one that God uses to counter those, and the one that God saves, lifts up and sits at the right hand of God. Now today we're going to move into the New Testament, but before we do I want to talk a little bit about that and the reason that we did Daniel yesterday. So if I were to say to you, we hold these truths to be self-evident, my guess is you're not going to get on the edge of your seat and wonder, what truths? What truths are self-evident? What is he going to tell us? You know what I'm talking about. I am quoting from the Declaration of Independence. If I were to say to you 87 years ago, you're not going to say, boy, that's a weird way to say 87 years ago. And let's see, 2020 minus 87, what happened 87 years ago? No, of course you're not going to do that. You're going to know I'm talking about the Gettysburg Address. It's just shorthand. There are so many other examples, of course, in American history. We do not have anything to fear but fear itself. And you wouldn't say, well, fear, what should I be afraid of? What are you talking about? You would know I'm talking about Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. Or even if I just use the number 9/11, you wouldn't say 911 what? But an image I know comes to your mind because it does of mine, of the World Trade Center in New York and the smoke coming out of the World Trade Center and all of that. All of that is shorthand that we use, but imagine if you were in another culture or in another time, those things would almost make no sense at all to you. You would need a footnote explaining it to you, or you would be completely lost. One of the huge deficits that all of us have about New Testament apocalyptic literature is that oftentimes it is quoting from their culture, but even more importantly, it is oftentimes quoting from the Old Testament, but we miss those Old Testament images, and so we can go very, very far awry by simply being unaware of how much quotation and how much kind of shorthand is being used. Some say that in Revelation there are more than one reference per verse to the Old Testament in aggregate over the whole book, and so over how many verses there are in Revelation, there are at least that many and maybe even a few more references to the Old Testament, but we miss most of those because none of us are good enough Old Testament scholars. So keep that in mind as we move into the New Testament today and see what Jesus had to say in some of his apocalyptic speaking. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is a section that is sometimes called the Little Apocalypse or the Apocalypse of Jesus, and it takes place during the week that he is going to be arrested. Palm Sunday has already happened, but Maundy Thursday has not yet happened. And the disciples and Jesus are at the temple, and the disciples look up at the temple and they say, wow, look at these huge stones that are making up this temple. And in a sense, they're kind of being tourists. They're from Galilee, they're kind of from the hick town, and now they're in the big city, and they're just amazed at this huge building. And of course, the temple is the very symbol of God's presence with the people, and it is the very center of religious power, spiritual power, and in some ways had an awful lot of political power as well. And so they're impressed by the temple. But you may remember Jesus' response to them is, I tell you the truth, not one of these stones will be on top of the other. They're all going to be thrown down. The disciples must ponder that for a while because they leave the temple and they walk across to the Mount of Olives, and they're sitting on the Mount of Olives and they're looking back across at Jerusalem, and there the temple is gleaming white in the sun. It would have been exactly where the Dome of the Rock is today in Jerusalem. This would have been a huge white gleaming temple, and they're looking over there and they're now wondering, what was it that he was trying to tell us? And so they said, tell us, Master, when will be the time that this will happen? What will be going on? When will you restore your kingdom? And Jesus then begins to explain to them in somewhat apocalyptic terms what will happen. And he explains that terrible things will happen. that there will be awful calamities happening in Jerusalem and in the world, that there will be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes. And he says, but all of those aren't actually what I'm talking about. But later, even more will come. And he says, pray that it's not in winter, or if it is, if it happens during a time that a woman is pregnant or nursing a child, it's going to be so much more difficult for her. He warns them that you will be brought over in front of magistrates and you will be accused and questioned. And he says, don't prepare your defense ahead of time. It's one of these wonderful, comforting things. He says the Holy Spirit will give you the words. The Holy Spirit is going to be with you during these awful, awful times. But then he continues, just making it sound so horrible, and then he makes it sound truly apocalyptic when he says, in those days the sun will be darkened, the moon won't give its light, and the stars will fall out of heaven, and all of the powers in heaven will be shaken. Now here, I don't think he's talking literally. He's not saying be watching and see when the moon disappears or the sun quits shining. He's just saying something like it's going to be a dark time. If I said to you, September 11, 2001 was a dark day, you may remember that day where I was in South Carolina, and I know in New York, it was bright and sunny, not a cloud in the sky, but it was a dark day in a different way. And Jesus is saying that, and he's saying all of this stuff is going to happen. And then he says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. And I hope that sounds familiar. If you watched yesterday's video, it should. Because what is Jesus doing here? He's giving us a little bit of shorthand. He is quoting Daniel. Just like if I were to tell you 7 years ago, you'd know I was quoting Abraham Lincoln. Here he is quoting Daniel. You'll see the Son of Man coming in clouds. Now, how does that work in Daniel, and how does that work in Jesus? It actually isn't the Son of Man coming down. It's actually the Son of Man going up, being lifted up, and being seated at the right hand of the Father. And what Jesus wants us to hear is when all of these calamities happen, when all of this hard, terrible, difficult things happen, you need to know God is going to be with you. And God is not going to be working in all of that evil and all of that darkness, but rather there will be the Son of Man. And of course, he's talking about himself. The Son of Man will have already conquered these things. And of course, we know that the Son of Man conquers death later in that week. And if death is conquered, what do we have to be afraid of? And so he gives us this, and he's really telling the disciples about something that is going to happen. Sometimes the apocalyptic literature stuff is just kind of a broad brushed, painted stuff. This kind of thing happens. But Jesus is talking about a specific event when he talks about the temple and it being thrown down. And you may know he's talking about 70 AD, when the Romans are going to come in and completely destroy Jerusalem, including completely destroying the temple. That's why it isn't there today. And there isn't one stone sitting on top of another. And there's one section in Jerusalem where you can actually see a pile of stones that they think came from the temple. And it's just a literal proof of this prediction that Jesus made. One stone not on top of the other. And what he is telling the disciples is, this is going to happen, but you need to know that actually this is a sign that the Son of Man has already risen into the clouds. This is a sign for you that it's okay even at that point. Now, AD 70 is a huge date for Judaism because this is essentially the end of the ancient nation of Israel. And this is the second great diaspora where Jews are sent all over the world. There was a long period of time where Rome would not allow any Jews to live in Jerusalem. This is also a huge date for the church because this is when the church realizes that it's not going to just be Judaism and it's not going to take over Judaism and then move forward, but it is now something obviously that has grown out of Judaism, but something different. And there is a sense in which at this point the church really becomes more Gentile than it is Jewish, and the church really becomes the church for everybody. Not that it wasn't already headed in that direction before them. But AD 70 is just a gigantic thing. And Jesus is saying this is going to happen. But later he says, when he's talking about the fact that that's not the end, that God has plans not only for the church but for the whole world, for the new heaven and the new earth that Revelation talks about. And God has plans to restore the whole earth to the way that God always wanted it to be. But Jesus is very clear in Matthew 24 and the other accounts here where he says, nobody, not anybody on earth, not the angels, not even the Son, but only the Father knows the day and the time. Now that's critical for us to know, because one of the things that tells us is the one thing we know for absolute certain is everybody who has ever predicted this will be the date of the end of the world, or we are definitely in the end times, they have been wrong. Whether it was 1,000 years ago or whether you saw it on TV yesterday, if they are predicting we are definitely in the end times, or they give you a date for when the end of the world can be, we know they are wrong unless they are God themselves. And that, of course, is not the case. Even the Son, Jesus says, does not know when the day and the hour is, and doesn't need to know. None of us do, because our job is to do just what he told us to do. When we are in these great calamitous times, we are to be witnesses, and we don't have to worry about what we're going to say, because the Holy Spirit will give us what we are to say. I want to slide forward quickly to Matthew 26. Just a day or two later, Jesus has now been arrested. He is taken before Caiaphas in order to be tried, and before Caiaphas calls witnesses. And let me pick up with Matthew 26, the 61st verse. One of the witnesses says, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it back in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so." Now what Jesus is saying there, "if you have said so," let's stop here a little bit, is essentially saying you're just not going to be able to understand this. He's not really saying, he's not trying to be a smart aleck or anything. He's really just kind of saying you're not going to understand this. You've said it, but you don't understand it. But then Jesus follows up, and this is really critical, and you will recognize what is going on here. "From now on," Jesus says, "you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now let's look at both of those clauses. From now on. What Jesus is saying is what's going to happen this week. Power is shifting. It's shifting from the temple being the sign of God's presence with the people to Jesus and the temple of his body being the sign of God's presence with the people. And just as in Daniel 6, Daniel is just a simple human being, and yet the evil powers of the hungry lions are not able to ultimately do him in, so too Jesus is just a simple human being in this sense, but the evil powers of the world, even though they will kill him, are not able to do him in. And so he is the new sign. From now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. And then there's this prediction, of course, of the end of time. And he will come on the clouds of power. So right now, and then when we get to AD 70, that prediction becomes literally true, where the physical symbol of God's presence with the people, the temple, is destroyed. The political power and the religious power in Israel is gone because of the Roman government tearing it all down. But it has already shifted to Jesus, and Jesus is already there, and he's already promised us that he will always be with us. And so we see here that apocalyptic literature is supposed to give us comfort for the present, particularly if we're going through a very difficult time. And part of that comfort is that God is with us now, and that we don't have to understand everything, and we don't have to understand what is going to happen in the future. We know that God has given us a job for right now, but God is empowering us in that job, and we are to do things in a godly and a Christ-like way in this time. We can't use evil to counter evil. We must use good to counter evil, even though that sometimes feels like the lesser power. It isn't. And that's what it's reminding us. But it also reminds us that there is the time to come when God will make all things right. And so we want to be a part of that. We want to be on that side of history. We want to make sure that we are in the army, if you will, of the Lord, and we want to be doing the things the way that the Lord wants us to do them. So from now on, we know that we have the Son of God seated in power beside the Almighty, cheering us on, giving us power, encouraging us, giving us the things to say and the things to do. And we also know that there will come the day that we will see him coming on the clouds in glory. And we know all of these things, we believe all of these things, we can do all of these things, not because we read them in some dead document, but because right here and right now, God is with us. Amen.